have not dealt well with this problem. And I think, first of all, we must be constantly cognizant of the need to protect freedom of speech. You know, we can't silence people with whom we disagree. And that particularly is germane to those who are repeating misinformation. But we need to do more research on how we can actually identify what is deliberate disinformation. And I think we have to also think about how to regulate that. And that's something that to date we've seen kind of fall on the responsibility of social media companies as opposed to governments. And there's a question about whether governments have to get more involved in how to regulate information, particularly on social media. And I think part of that is there needs to be more research on the money trail for how disinformation is being produced in democracies. There's been some research about organizations through which money is flowing. There was a very good report by the Newsline Institute that was elaborated on recently in the New York Times. But we really don't know that much about the mechanisms with which the Chinese government and perhaps the Russian government are helping to subsidize disinformation in the West. I think we also have to think about the future. We just had a panel in this room about AI, and I mentioned that I don't feel that liberal democracies have done a good job in how to regulate information on social media. That is only going to become more and more difficult in the near future. As we have AI content creation. And so I think as democracies are trying to understand how to regulate AI, this is one aspect that has to be thought about, is what role will AI play in the creation of disinformation. And then finally, I think it's important that we also focus much more than is the case now on education about information literacy. And this is something that I think liberal democracies can do both in their own countries and around the world in terms of thinking about contributions to global development. This is such an important issue. I think that it's going to be more and more difficult. We're seeing, at least in the United States, this is very much the case, but I think it's spreading around the world. We're seeing a lack of trust in traditional media outlets, which is allowing disinformation to take root much more rapidly and be reproduced as misinformation. And it's really important that we're thinking about how the next generation in all of our countries is consuming information and how they can determine what is truth and what is not. So I'll leave my comments to that and pass it on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Roberts. Next up is Rushan Abbas, who is the director and founder of the NGO Campaign for Uyghurs, an NGO that has been nominated to the Nobel Peace Prize. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear honorable guests, first I want to thank you for your collective efforts fighting against China's Uyghur genocide. The state terrorism against the Uyghurs and the other ethnicities in East Turkestan is a chilling glimpse into the future, one where authoritarian regimes use artificial intelligence, surveillance systems, media manipulation, and the massive propaganda to serve sinister purposes to blur the lines between the truth and the falsehood, to stifle any defiance and hide unimaginable crimes. The CCP is not only avoiding the accountability for the Uyghur genocide and the state-sponsored oppression, in Tibet, but is also engaging in widespread attacks on activists and the scholars and spreading misinformation and the disinformation and propaganda through various media platforms. Beijing uses tactics of intimidation and the hostage-taking to silence the voices of Uyghurs, actions that directly violate international laws and the fundamental principles of rule-based global order. The CCP specifically targets the family members of those who dare to speak out. I have been personally endured the repercussion of this retaliation. My exercise of free speech and activism in the United States, participating on a panel like this with Dr. Sean Roberts and the others at Hudson Institute in 2018, in September, resulted in unjust imprisonment of my dear sister, Dr. Gulshan Abbas. It's a difficult decision to make, to use your voice to raise awareness when your entire community is at risk of extinction, or stay quiet with the hope that your family may be spared. The more success an advocate has in raising awareness for the cause, the larger the target grows on our backs and the backs of our families. My friend Dolko Nisa and the many other of the activists here, including our organizations like the World Uyghur Congress and Campaign for Uyghurs, are being the target and the victims of these. As Rabbi Cooper described earlier, how even non-Uyghur individuals in the United States will not attend a commemoration event due to the fear instilled by the long arm of the CCP. If we continue to allow the CCP to intimidate people in the democratic countries, the pockets of the world where true liberty exists will continue to shrink. We are dealing with an actor whose survival is based on how successfully it can falsify the truth and mislead others. Social media platforms have become a battleground for information dissemination and shaping the public opinion. Chinese government-backed trolls and the bots frequently flood discussions with false narratives and causing confusions. In an era where information is power, it's essential to understand the extent to which the Chinese government spreads misinformation and targets individuals and the NGOs and manipulates the narrative to maintain the control in the public spora. Within East Turkestan, there has been a shift towards the imposing heavy prison sentences and subjecting Uyghurs to slavery within forced labor facilities. This shift indicated an intensification of the oppression faced by the Uyghurs as the Chinese government seeks to legitimize these detention centers and the forced labor facilities. Meanwhile, China extends invitations to Global South leaders and Han Chinese tourists for carefully curated tours of East Turkestan. They present a distorted image concealing atrocities inflicted upon the Uyghur people while showcasing propaganda of Uyghurs dancing and singing. Our responsibility is to reject deceitful displays we are shown. We must unite in the belief that as long as Uyghurs are unable to speak openly without fear or coercion, they are victims of cultural erasure and the genocide deserving of justice. I will conclude with a quote from Nobel Peace Prize nominee and international human rights lawyer David Matas. In quote, "Unless today's victims are defended, we run the risk of becoming tomorrow's victims," end quote. We cannot wait any longer. Concrete actions, not empty words, are needed. The international community must come together to decisively end China's reign of terror, protecting the dignity and rights of the Uyghur people, not just for the Uyghurs, but the future of the free world that we all are responsible to defend for our children's sake. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Roshan. The third panelist is David Legam, who is a Swedish member of the European Parliament and the member initiating the recognition of the genocide in the European Parliament. Additionally, he started the Uyghur Friendship Group in the European Parliament. The floor is yours, Mr. Legam.
Thank you so much, dear friends, distinguished guests, hosts. I just have to start by saying that after listening to all these panelists, hearing and talking to so many people here, and also after watching these horrible VR images and videos, it's hard to say that it's a pleasure being here, but indeed it's a privilege to be here. And for me, that's a big difference. Because we know just how much of a privilege when we recall how greatly the basic freedoms of Uyghurs and so many others, especially from minority communities in China, are systematically repressed by the Chinese Communist Party, including, most basically of all, the freedom just to speak our minds free from fear. And we see how Uyghurs en masse have been re-educated, as they say, when it's really part of a policy of systemic genocide. Let's just call it like it is. And we see how the Chinese Communist Party's intimidation campaigns against those who speak out and those who push back, whether Chinese or foreigner, whether in China or abroad, I can attest to that personally, as I know many of you in here can as well. I am here, of course, representing myself and my party at national level. It's Sweden's Christian Democrats, and Europe-wide, the European People's Party, which many of the European parties represent here today also belong to. But as you said, I'm also here as a member of the European Parliament, and I can tell you also that the European Parliament, we have taken, finally, a tough stance. In March 2021, the Chinese regime imposed counter-sanctions on several of our elected members, including me and others, the members of the Subcommittee on Human Rights, after the EU's Foreign Affairs Council agreed to impose targeted sanctions on high-level officials and one entity that was directly responsible for serious human rights violations, including the large-scale arbitrary detention and degrading treatment of Uyghurs, as we wrote it. We, of course, condemned the counter-sanctions as arbitrary, unsubstantiated, and without legal justification, completely, totally unacceptable. I know many of you or your compatriots have been similarly targeted for retaliation, and many companies as well also faced intimidation, including one of Sweden's biggest brands, H&M. So what happened next after that? The massive investment deal, which the EU and China had just agreed on after Christmas 2020, was frozen. And it's still frozen. As a center-right politician from Sweden, I love free trade. But the Chinese regime has simply not earned a change in our position. I, for one, will not budge, and I don't think my fellow members of the European Parliament will either. We have been crystal clear in repeatedly stating that we will take the human rights situation in China into consideration if and when the Parliament is asked to some time later greenlight the investment deal. But we went even further. 1 year later, in June 2022, as you also said, on my initiative, the European Parliament recognized for the first time crimes against humanity and a serious risk of genocide being perpetrated in Xinjiang by the Chinese Communist Party. On 2 separate occasions since then, I have formally asked the European Commission, our EU executive branch, what steps are being taken to either prevent or punish such atrocities. And I will keep fighting for the human rights of the Uyghur people and of all people in China. As horrific as the regime's treatment of Uyghurs and others within China has been, we also know that this doesn't just affect Chinese citizens. Very close to home, for me, the regime is still wrongfully imprisoning one Swedish citizen, Gui Minhai, whose only crime was not in spying, as the regime claims, but in speaking up and speaking out about that regime's abuses. For this, they threw him in jail following a secret trial, and we see again, all too clearly, with China as being voted again in October for the 6th term to the UN's Human Rights Council, how big their influence in the world is. Though with its second lowest vote ever, thanks in large part to many of you in here today and the partners you represent. So in the European Parliament and other institutions, we have also finally even banned TikTok, since we are more and more wary of the increasingly long arm of China's surveillance. On the topic of our panel today, the machinery of Chinese propaganda in furthering the CCP's political objectives, I might introduce here at the outset a reality which I know we are probably all experiencing as we stand up for human rights, and that is the reality not only of a more aggressive rhetoric, but of more nuanced rhetoric, as the CCP gets better at malign influence. We know very well the familiar phrases encouraging correct judgment and warning us to protect our political reputation, even warning us outright that we will be held responsible for all consequences. And that is no small thing, coming from a country with a superpower economy, hundreds of nuclear weapons, and the biggest police state in human history. But are we also prepared for the Chinese regime's more careful diplomacy, for arguments more carefully written, arguments which recall our own country's past or current failings? Arguments which mix truth with lies, so we have really to be on our toes, not just to convince our own fellow citizens or our Chinese interlocutors, but to convince so much of the rest of the world which is hedging its bet, maybe even getting big promises from the Chinese regime, and in any case hoping, as long as possible, not to have to commit to one way or the other. The CCP is not modest in its fight against freedom of religion and of expression. So we know their aims. The regime wants world domination, and we see how much of a threat freedom is to this regime, so we know the stakes. And this is the competition that we face. We have to be clearer, we have to be tougher in defense of human rights. We have to be more united, whether from an EU perspective, this means in our Council of EU member state governments, or the European Commission's high-level dialogue with China, or more specifically, the newly resumed high-level dialogue on human rights. It means not rewarding the regime when it does nothing to change its behavior, and continuing to call out its genocidal policies. And that's why I'm committed to doing this as long as I'm a member of the European Parliament. And finally, also, it means continuing to deepen our partnerships among those of us fighting for human rights and for democratic values, which is why this Uyghur International Forum is so urgently vital. And that's why I'm so grateful to the World Uyghur Congress, to the Japan Uyghur Association, and the Japan Uyghur Parliamentary Caucus and Japanese Parliamentary Caucus to investigate and to take action on human rights abuses committed by China. And I thank you for the opportunity to join here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lega. Next up, I'm very happy to present Nathan Rusher, who is a researcher at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, who became famous and viral following his discoveries analyzing satellites and open source data to expose secret military strategies and movements. The floor is yours, Nathan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Yeah, it's difficult to talk about the idea of Chinese misinformation very quickly, because if there was a silver bullet to it, I think we wouldn't be having the information environment we see, everyone in this room sees. So I think for my contribution here, I kind of want to break it down into some epistemological framework to look at how some of this misinformation targets people, some practical opportunities to change minds, and some techniques on how to do that, if y'all don't mind. So I think when we first start looking at this methods of misinformation and disinformation, we can look at it through the prism of the methods and the targets. So there is the method of oversaturation, to try and basically oversaturate the media environment through, admittedly, people that are already largely sycophants for the Chinese Communist Party, and to change the conversation, to dominate the conversation. There is also, and in many cases I think this applies most strongly in democratic and Western countries, is where we see this. Domestically, the goal is to drum up nationalistic support for Chinese policies throughout the region. And I think most importantly, for people with a vested interests in China, is to provide them with what I would call implausible deniability of state abuses and to justify inaction through the idea of this reality being unclear. And I think this is largely effective in societies and with governments in non-democratic and non-Western countries, along with business entities and other people where relations with China is makes the situation of confronting reality deeply inconvenient. And of course, this isn't a comprehensive breakdown. We could do a whole conference on how this works, but I hope this is a helpful way to start sort of thinking about the issue. I'd argue that in highly democratic nations, like I said, this misinformation and this oversaturation has had limited effect. And I think we can see from basically the bipartisan nature of many of the legislators represented here that the reality is sort of cutting through the misinformation in a lot of places in the West. There are going to be obvious sycophants. There are going to be, and I think everyone in this room very regularly comes against people, denialists and fanboys, and I think we see this as a very elevated thing. But I think in reality, the mainstream view is that reality is cutting through. Domestically in China, I don't think there's a lot that we can do that will ever be heard, as unfortunate as that is. And I think for growth and to change minds, that leaves this last category where meaningful change can be made. People for whom the reality of the situation in Xinjiang is deeply inconvenient for their personal or their business interests. And of course, part of this change should come from untangling these vested interests from decision makers. But I also think it's important to sort of force people to confront the implausibility of much of this disinformation and denialism. And so I want to talk a bit more about that phrase, implausible deniability, which I think is a really apt way to describe sort of a lot of China's misinformation, especially targeting much of the world. It's the idea of providing this information framework, this alternate reality, no matter how implausible, that provides people who have a vested interest in denying the reality just enough of a kernel to grab onto and to sort of argue, just enough meat to convince themselves of this Potemkin reality that China has sort of pushed forward. And I think in this case it's tricky because it doesn't matter really how easy these claims are to disprove. Without the opportunity to directly confront it with people, the implausibility doesn't matter because the fact is that this narrative exists and that narrative itself is the goal. So like often there is this idea that both China and the West are politicizing and exploiting the situation and the Uyghur crisis for their own personal gain. And therefore neither side can be fully trusted and both sides are engaging in propaganda and reality is somewhere in the middle. The evidence points clearly opposite to that, but I think this is a narrative that I think a lot of people and a lot of vested interests have sort of grasped onto. And I'm not going to pretend that I have any solid answers on how to cut through that disinformation clearly and how to change a lot of the minds, but I hope this sort of epistemological framework of this implausible deniability is, I guess, helpful to some of the policymakers and the advocacy groups in the room. But as far as policy options go, I think both for government officials and the parliamentarians here, but especially for activists and advocacy groups, this means there should be a deeper and more sincere engagement with unconvinced media, civil society groups, and even sometimes governments on the issue of the Uyghur crisis, especially in places where there's a population that cares, but largely institutions and governments that is unable to speak out or unwilling to speak out. Places that are even represented in the room here, such as Malaysia or the Maldives, but also Indonesia, and even places like Lebanon and Iraq. And to guide media and especially civil society through the, by now, indisputable primary evidence of the human rights abuses. and to try and cut through this idea that both sides are engaged in propaganda. This also means to tolerate often biased or pointed questions and to be able to respond to these calmly and objectively, although insistently, with demonstrable facts. And to a certain extent, on a practical perspective, I think it's helpful not just to provide analysis of the situation, but also to demonstrate both the facts and the implausibility of China's misinformation narrative, with data points that can be easily demonstrated and cannot be easily dismissed. And this has been central to a lot of the work that myself and others have done on human rights in Western China. If you don't believe us, you can look at the satellite imagery, you can check it yourself. And how I have personally viewed the importance of debunking a few of these propaganda claims through this classic, I guess, techniques of verification. And in doing this, we point directly to the primary source evidence. We find satellite imagery of internment facilities, clearly walking through the features that separate this from government offices or schools or other innocuous places, or pointing to official Chinese documentation demonstrating the drop in birth rates, the sharing imagery of mosques and shrines that have been demolished and replaced with vacant land. One particular method that we've used to directly counter this misinformation is to use verification techniques to spatially analyze, and using an open source mindset to analyze these Potemkin tours that the Chinese state uses to propagandize their version of reality. So using these techniques, we're able to geolocate and track these propaganda tours and demonstrate that all the apparently spontaneous locations visited are actually clearly government-run, government-organized facilities and locations that serve to push that propaganda narrative and don't actually represent the reality on the ground in Xinjiang. This method also allows us to demonstrate the sites of repression that these tours deliberately pass by without noticing them. We can sort of we can publicize, for example, public marketplaces that have been demolished, mosques that have been demolished, shrines that have been demolished, and internment camps that these tours necessarily pass directly by. One video that stands out in my mind was a propaganda vlog by one of those expat journalists that we often come up against. And one of the shots in that video was him filming with his smartphone outside the window of the approach into Urumqi airport. And I remember it was presented with the editorialization of something like, "All I see here is beautiful Urumqi, I don't see any concentration camps." Of course, in the video there were, I think, 11 concentration camps and internment facilities that could be seen directly out of the window of the airport. And by pointing these out, I think it demonstrates and helps cut through the narrative. And one of those facilities actually, in a way it was useful because it gave us what I would say is the best visual evidence we have of Midong's women's prison in Urumqi, which is a very prominent prison that a lot of prominent activists are held at, including, it's rumoured to be eminent scholar, and a lot of the people, his dear friend Rahel Dawood is rumoured to be being held there. And if anyone wants to get advice on sort of the technical aspects of that, which we can't explore in here, feel free to reach out to me later, and I'm happy to help. And another example that stands out is when another expat propagandist shared a video claiming to show a mosque under construction in Western China. And the implication was, this mosque is under construction, therefore there can be no religious prosecution. By geolocating the mosque that was filmed and sort of establishing a timeline of the facility, we can establish that what the video actually showed was the rectification, the de-Islamification of that mosque. We could show the satellite imagery before showing domes and minarets, and the satellite imagery afterwards that showed all these Islamic architecture purely lopped off and completely removed from the structure. And I guess these are just a few examples to sort of start to show the ways in which these verification and open source techniques can sort of directly counter and cut through a lot of the propaganda claims. And I think I should probably stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we all appreciate the very concrete examples, and I know I at least will use them in my next weeks in my work. And the last panelist is Kaori Arimori, who is a political commentator and reporter from Japan, focused on China and foreign affairs. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I am a Japanese journalist, so I want to speak in Japanese language, but this time all of the panelists, including moderator, is English speaker, so I will speak in English. 私は日本人ですけれども、今日はモデレーター含め全員がパネリスト全員が、英語話者ですので、私も今日は英語で、話をさせていただきます。I am a Japanese journalist based in Tokyo, and I started covering and writing the Uyghur issue in 2009, just after the Urumqi incident. And around then, I got a chance to meet some Uyghur activists, including President Do Kung-yeol of World Uyghur Congress and Umair Kanat in Washington, D.C. And I have kept in touch with them, so gathering the information, and I sometimes wrote my articles and columns about the Uyghur issues. And now I think this conference is very meaningful and significant for Japanese society, because the fact this conference is held in Tokyo, in Japan, my country, get to be the power to push back the Chinese propaganda powers. So I think this is good, and I respect and I say thank you to all staffs of the World Uyghur Congress and staffs of the Japan Uyghur Association. This is so wonderful. So, 2009, since before then, I featured the Tibet issues, and I also criticized so bad about the Chinese policy. So I have a long story about these issues. So I have already gotten the bad reputation as an anti-China person. So now I have nothing to be afraid of. But around 2009, most of the Japanese mainstream media are not positive for featuring this issue, Uyghur issue, and Tibet also, because they are extremely afraid of China's backlash for their work. And therefore, many Japanese reporters and researchers are not able to get chances to work on these issues. And now, the most serious problem with covering the issue, Uyghur issue, and that it's difficult for us to travel in the Uyghur region, and we can hear directly the voices of the Uyghur people. So that's a very, very serious problem. Even in Japan, it's not easy for us to interview the Uyghur people here, because they are afraid of that their family is get to be into the bad situation or worse situation in their home country. This is so serious problem. And now Japanese situation on medias and people's awareness of these issues is getting better. But in other hand, the situation in the Uyghur region is getting worse, And I think awareness of Uyghur issue in Japan is increased dramatically over the past few years. It's not due to the political powers or politicians' powers or big medias, but the result of the grassroots activism of Uyghurs in Japan and also Japanese supporters, such as delivering these small books about the testimony of the Uyghur women who are in the concentration camps. So, but anyway, so our situation is getting better. But in AM, this session, someone said that Japan used to be the only non-Western country to sign the joint statements condemning Uyghur genocide at the UN every year since 2019 during the Abe's second administration. That's true. But I think it's not enough for us because so US, like the US government or European governments, or no, parliaments, Japan, the parliaments in Japan should not did not recognize Uyghur genocide. I think the Japanese parliament should do that. And Japanese government should make a regulation or law prohibiting Uyghur forced labor as soon as possible. But I think the people awareness for this issue is getting bigger, but I think it's not enough. So I have a lot of things to do. And, but I want to explain, recent years, the Japan situation is getting bigger. So I think this is two reasons. One of the reasons why our country was the leader or was the only non-Western country to sign the joint statement in UN is so one of the first reason is that former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe himself was a politician who was very enthusiastic about the Uyghur issue. So he helped a Uyghur scholar 2009 by direct conversation with Hu Jintao when he came to Japan. So this is the one reason Japan was the only non-Western country to sign this statement in UN. And the other is, as I said, so that is the so grassroots activities, and also so Uyghurs here in Japan are making effort to spread their own issues. No. Okay? So, okay. The other reason is, I said, increasing public awareness of on Uyghur issue in Japan is so due to the grassroots activities of Uyghurs here, and also Japanese supporters. And so regarding Chinese propaganda, China often conducts a bad propaganda for us to Japan. And they sometimes so do the bad propaganda for making another history regarding Japan and also Uyghurs. This year in August, this year in February, China's People Daily, Chinese media, so put the article about the Japanese culture. This is a kind of typical cultural appropriation. They are featuring some sweets originated in Tang Dynasty, they said. But this is completely incorrect. This is incorrect. So they show the picture But these sweets are different from sweets in dynasty, the Tang Dynasty. This is our traditional sweets that is named nerukiri. That is origin so 300 years ago in Japan. And in this article, not only stealing our culture, they also featuring Han Chinese female sweet makers living in Uyghur region. And one Han Chinese woman living in Uyghur region is making the Tang Dynasty traditional sweets. And so they were writing, this is a kind of origin of the sweets of the world. So I saw, wow. And some of the Japanese believe that's true. And on social media, some Japanese said, oh, wow, we didn't know this is the origin of our sweets or something. So I cannot say the bad words. I'm sorry. And so like this, China is doing, most of every day, doing a bad propaganda for us, and then they are mixing the aspects of the Uyghurs. So I think we have to push back so strongly by the political power or by the power of information. And also, I say again, so this conference, the fact this conference is held in Japan, in Tokyo, is a good, get to be the good power for pushing back their bad propaganda. And I am so encouraged by this opportunity. And so I will do my best for pushing back their propaganda. And so recently, they are doing another propaganda for us, such as the recent issue that is the treated water at the nuclear power plants. This is one of the example. And they are, when they do this propaganda, they want to conceal about their, barbaric actions. So we have to see more carefully what happens in China, and we have to always relate their propaganda about these things every day. So at last, I want to say this is a good opportunity, and this is a significant conference for Uyghurs, for us, and all of us, especially Japanese. So I think so we want to say to the Japanese mainstream media and also the politicians to make our stages to release the truth about the Uyghur issues, and also we should have the laws or regulations against Uyghur genocide, and especially the Uyghur forced labor as soon as possible. So from tomorrow, I will start to restart to write about these things, and sometimes I should more strongly criticize our government and parliaments. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are running out of time. Therefore, I will just ask each panelist for one short advice in the end. I would like each one of you to mention one thing you think is most important for the community in the future. So whether to academics, to politicians, civil society, or journalists, if you can mention one thing you think is most important to combat the Chinese propaganda. And I will start by asking Professor Roberts.
I guess I already kind of outlined some recommendations, but I think of those probably the most important is really trying to understand when we're seeing deliberately falsified information, and understanding that that is often targeting specific political entanglements domestically in an attempt to further drive divisions. And I would also just add to that maybe that given that the Uyghur movement is losing the information war in the global south, there has to be a focus on how we can help other countries also identify that false information.
Perfect, thank you. So moving on to Russian.
I think we need to tighten the laws and the laws and enforcement and rules and legislations, because it's already so difficult for Uyghur people, Uyghur activists, and the scholars being targeted by the Chinese government. And while we are fighting to raise awareness and educate the international communities, but we are not being protected by anywhere. When they attack us using the social media, using the freedom of speech, which the social media and the freedom of speech is not available in China for the ordinary Chinese people, we don't have anywhere to turn to, FBI or other, legislations. They all write this off as a freedom of speech. So how do we protect ourselves from this kind of attacks and the disinformation and the propaganda? Well, basically, Chinese government is winning using the freedom and democracy and the free platforms we have in the West to attack and to target the freedom and democracy. So it is extremely important to give us some sort of tools or help us and protect our rights too. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is MEP David Lega.
Thank you. I will also be brief. The rabbi this morning talked about the Yiddish word schlepp. I would like to add chutzpah. We have to be bold and brave, and it sounds easy, but I think the way to do it is to understand that we are not alone. We are many, and when we work together, we make a difference. When I just recently had threats sent to my home from the Chinese ambassador, he sent letters to my home address threatening me otherwise to suffer all the consequences in the future. When they did that, we joined, just like my MP from Canada suggested, we joined together with all my colleagues from different parties. We got together and we formed an alliance and said this is not okay. And it ended up with the ambassador being sent home to China. So we can make a difference. We just have to try it.
Thank you. Mr. Russia?
I guess I might be a bit cheeky here and try to slip two in. But I think for advocates and activists, I would say my biggest piece of advice is we all come across bad faith actors every day trying to deny what's happening, trying to fight their version of the narrative. And I would say that a big portion of the strategy of this is to waste energy. And so I would say to all the activists, don't waste your energy on bad faith actors. Counterclaims, provide summaries of the reality, but don't try and change minds of people who came here to waste your energy. And I would say to the policymakers, when we look at politicians and people that I guess are on the policy side of things, I think I would just say that considering a lot of the battleground for this information war is in the global south and is in non-Western and not necessarily the most democratic countries. I think it's important to be mindful of when politicians in the West openly politicize this issue, how that can have a somewhat detrimental effect on how people in the global South see this issue, see the crisis.
Thank you. And our last piece of advice is from Ms. Arimoto.
Yes. I really think the unite is the most important. And so, as I said, so Japanese parliament and government are not enough to to save Uyghurs from the genocide by the Chinese authority. I think so. Our government and parliament are lack of the international unite with other countries. And I think this conference, I hope this conference get to be the big chance to make the big unite with other countries. And we should learn from European countries, US and Canada, so how to make the regulations for forced labors, or how to make other rules, or how to protect that some forced labor goods flooding to our country. So I think the key point is the unite with other countries, and we have to learn from others. And so I think Japan is only one only Asian countries to do this issue, such as the non-Western country to sign the joint statement condemning in UN. So I think this is not meaningful, because non-Western country so make no sense. So I think our country should be the champion of the human rights, and so to save Uyghurs. So I think we should learn more from other countries, and I really, really hope this conference can be the first step for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening. I think we can summarize by saying this conference is a great initiative. Together we can do great things. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you very much to all 5 panelists.
We'll ask everyone to stay in the room. We're going to follow right now with another panel, which is the last session of the day. It's going to be on Uyghur forced labor. So I would welcome all the speakers. Hazırtdaki paliyet tügmedi en ahırki jığın kaldı. Uyghur mecbur emgek doğruluk pek mühim. Şoňa müňlarning oturup müşäde anlaşyňlaryny talep kılýmyz.
長時間のご参加ありがとうございます。後にパネル4が始まりますが、皆様ご参加いただきたいです。よろしくお願いいたします。